All right. So, given it's our last podcast before the federal election, that means it's our last chance to talk through some of the proposed policies before we find out which of these will be happening and which will be ditched for at least another 3 years. But one policy proposal which hasn't been discussed that much but could have a huge impact on Australia's housing supply dilemma is the Coalition's $5 billion infrastructure bottleneck busting fund. Now, someone who's written a bit about this in a recent column for the AFR is Peter Tulip, who's the chief economist at the Centre for Independent Studies. G'day, Peter. Welcome to the Savings Tip Jar.
G'day, Dominic. G'day, Harrison.
Thanks for being here, Peter. I think, it's your second appearance now. I think you were way back when our episode count was in the 20s. So we've come a long way since then, and I'm sure that you're glad to be back with us too, bozos. But before we launch into all of that housing policy election talk, do you have a savings tip for us?
Yeah, so I'm an economist, and so lots of friends and relatives ask me for advice as to where they should put their money. And I think the answer is very clear and very simple. You want to put it in an equity index fund that you get a high rate of return, not every year, but on average, and it's incredibly simple. So unless you have unusual finances, you shouldn't put your money in property, you shouldn't buy shares. Just go to the Vanguard site and put it in an equity index fund, or even better than that, if you under the concessional cap, do it via your super. That's my advice every time I get asked.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly seems like index funds are really in vogue at the moment. I think people have really found out that, stock picking yourself or, even just actively managed funds more often than not fail to beat the index. So I think more and more people are just going for that really.
It's completely hassle-free. It takes you 15 minutes to enroll. You don't need to think about it, and then you've got 10 minutes of work when you do your taxes once a year.
It's what they mean when they say, let the money do the work for you.
Yep.
Yeah, good stuff. Now, getting into the main talking point today, which is about this $5 billion infrastructure fund. Can you just kind of maybe explain a little bit about what that's all about and the significance behind it? And also perhaps why it hasn't been discussed that much? I mean, you've described it yourself as the sleeper policy. Why is that?
We have a housing affordability crisis. The big reason for that is that we're not building enough homes. One of the big things that the government can do to get more homes built is to spend more money on housing-friendly infrastructure. That is roads and sewers. There are if you talk to developers, a lot of them will say, I could build 1,000 homes in this suburb, but Sydney Water won't connect the sewerage, or the council won't build the road, or often fairly simple, trivial things that actually cost a relatively small amount of money per dwelling, often at the order of $10,000 a dwelling, $15,000 a dwelling. That is something the government could do that delivers an enormous bang for the buck. The government doesn't need to build new homes to increase housing supply because the private sector is busting to do it. You just need to remove a few simple roadblocks that get those out of the way, and then the private sector will do all the work for you.
It seems like where I'm from, in Melbourne, there's a lot of suburbs popping out on the far fringes of the city. And right now they seem like a bit of a penalty to live in because the infrastructure is terrible. They want to connect sewage. There's one road in, one road out. But right now, with that policy, it looks pretty good. And it's all the boring stuff, right? Like it's not going to raise attention in mainstream media. Because it's not, a cash splash, but it could be like that back end work that frees up some supply.
I think you're exactly right, Harrison. And it's not the most visual of stories, particularly for the TV news. They don't like running stories on sewerage for understandable reasons, maybe.
but around dinner time, 6 o'clock news.
But it's actually important.
Yeah, that's right. We'll jump now. This is going to be a bit of a hodgepodge of all the policies bandied about. I particularly like your take in the AFR article you wrote, Peter, about the mortgage interest deduction and why it kind of stinks a little bit. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so what we were just talking about in terms of the coalition's proposal for housing-friendly infrastructure strikes me as maybe the best policy that's being discussed in this election campaign. One of the coalition's other policies, which is mortgage deductibility, is one of the worst. So I'm trying to be balanced here. It's sort of like the first homeowner grants. First homeowner grants, first homeowners will get $10,000 from often their state government to buy a home. The mortgage deductibility is similar to that, only it's a lot more expensive. We're talking $60,000 instead of $10,000, and it's mainly of most benefit to high income earners. You get a big deduction if you're on the top bracket, and a smaller deduction for lower brackets. And it doesn't give buyers the money when they most need it. I think the common story we hear is that buyers, they can make the repayments, but it's the deposit that is really difficult, getting that together. And this doesn't address that. It helps on the repayments, which is not the real obstacle to home ownership. So, and the big problem with this that is actually shared by a lot of other policies being discussed in this election is that it's a subsidy to demand. So that the lucky recipients will go along to an auction. They've now got $60,000 extra to play with. They will bid more aggressively. And if they're unlucky enough, first, one of the other buyers is in the same position, they both bid up against each other. Neither wins. And the seller makes a fortune, but prices are more expensive both for the recipients, but for everyone else also. So it's bad for overall housing affordability.
We've definitely seen the demand side policies regarding housing dominating the debates lately, and it's on both sides of policy. Of politics, we've got the coalition, obviously, with the mortgage interest deductions and the super for housing, and then on the Labor side of things, they're also the expansion of the 5% deposit guarantee. But on the Labor side, they're also proposing to address the supply issue, but in a very different manner to somewhat different manner to the coalition's $5 billion infrastructure fund. They're announcing $10 billion towards building 100,000 homes. Now, how do you think that compares with the coalition's $5 billion fund?
So the main difference between the various policies, most of which you just listed, is the difference between supply and demand. The demand side policies lead to higher prices, supply side policies improve affordability. So, and what the government is proposing is a supply side measure. So it ticks the most important box. That's good. I don't think it is quite as effective as the coalition policy at boosting supply, mainly because, okay, we don't know all the details, but from the way they're talking about it, it sounds like the government will be doing a lot of the building. And that's not needed. Even with doing it more efficiently than normal public housing is still going to cost you $300,000 or $400,000 to supply an extra public housing unit. That's because the government is doing it all itself. It doesn't need to do that. You just remove the obstacles and the private sector will do it for almost no charge to the taxpayer. So I think the coalition policy for that reason gives you a much better bang for the buck.
Now, this next one, Peter, might be a bit more philosophical in nature, but it might go away as to explaining maybe your take on the serviceability buffer, which we'll get into later. But it seems like since COVID, the public and the government response to these issues has been, say, more government intervention. With more cash handouts, either when they're for energy bills or housing or so on and so forth. How can you explain the situation where these don't really serve the public in the long term, and that maybe easing red tape and doing things like the infrastructure bottleneck easing will aid home buyers in the future for longer, because it's kind of, politicians haven't really addressed it in any material way, and it's kind of hard to explain to people who see these handouts and think of that as just an easy, $10,000 in their pocket. How do you explain the lack of or easing red tape is actually better for people in the long run?
Yeah, you're right, Harrison. There's a lot of research that's been done by people such as myself as to why housing is so expensive, in particular in our big cities. And the big reason is because of planning restrictions, that we just stop people putting up apartments or townhouses or increased density. We stop houses going up in greenfields on the outskirts for a mix of reasons. And some of them are good, but they do pose an enormous cost. And there's report after report finding that. And I think the state governments, especially in New South Wales and Victoria, understand that, and they're trying hard to lift some of those restrictions to allow more building. The problem is at a federal level, the federal government doesn't actually control those restrictions that are put on housing. And so it's limited. The federal government is limited in what it can do. But because housing affordability is a very top issue, both sides of politics want to do something about it. And so we get a lot of these other policies, some of which seem quite gimmicky, but you get spending proposals and regulatory proposals. And I think a lot of it is just for appearance's sake, that the political parties are trying to give the impression that they care and that they understand the nature of the issue and that they're doing something about it. So a lot of it is action without effectiveness.
Yeah, I wonder if a lot of it is also down to, trust. Like the public doesn't trust our governments or our politicians to deliver. So, when they talk about these big picture policies, like $5 billion towards, breaking bottlenecks and reducing red tape, we don't know for sure whether that's actually going to happen. Whereas, compared to them actually saying, we're actually going to offer 100,000 Australians this much money to go towards a deposit or that, we can sort of expect that would actually happen rather than these sort of big picture things. But I guess getting back,
if I can riff on that just a little bit, it is a problem that the supply restrictions are a little bit harder to explain to the public. That I think first home buyers, when they're told, here's $60,000, go and buy a house with it, that's immediate and the benefit is direct and easily understood. When people are told, well, if you go and off to an auction with that money, you're going to bid up prices on everyone else and all the other recipients are doing that to you, those second round effects are harder to see. And unfortunately, some voters don't think it through that far. And so there's a superficial appeal in a direct grant that, okay, so not everyone studies economics. Not everyone understands that when you increase supply of a good, the price goes down. I think most people get it, but there are enough voters out there that don't to make policy setting difficult.
Yeah, I guess just some of these policies are much more tangible than others. You can actually really understand, a lump of cash in your bank account over, big picture policy. Like, we're going to build 100,000 homes with this $10 billion fund, but we're not sure how. But getting back to some of these demand side policies that you're not a huge fan of, one of the ones that the coalition was proposing is to actually somewhat, gently force the APRA to lower the serviceability buffer from 3 to back to 2.5%, which it originally was. But I understand that you actually think, even though you're quite against these sort of demand side policies, you actually think the serviceability buffer should be abolished altogether. Do you mind elaborating on that a bit?
I do think that. I think the serviceability buffer is very poorly designed. I understand its objectives. There are much better instruments under APRA's control that it can use to achieve that. The lending conditions should be mutually agreed by the lender and the borrower. And if they think that a loan is repayable, then third parties should butt out. APRA has no business, no real interest in intervening to stop a loan that the buyer and the lender mutually agree on. Now, it may be that APRA knows something that the buyer and the lender don't know. Tell us. A bit of information and guidance, I think, would be of enormous benefit. I mean, in particular to the people that go to your website. A lot of people are actually looking for information on how to manage their financial affairs. If APRA thinks a lot of people are making silly decisions, a bit of guidance and information would be really useful. But most of this is just straight paternalism. The government thinks, someone taking on a risky debt is behaving in a way that APRA doesn't like. I mean, that's not really APRA's business. If someone wants to take on a very high mortgage, then if they understand the sacrifices that involves and the risks that involves, that should be their decision. And so that's the big picture issue. And then you get a whole lot of little quirks that these regulations are just stopping a lot of what seem to be very worthwhile loans. And it's very badly designed in that respect, which I'm happy to get into if you want.
Due to time, Peter, I think we'll keep cycling through. And I
Sure.
kind of liked your point there. Like, I think most people can get behind that idea where it should be a mutual obligation between lender and borrower rather than, a pesky third party getting in the way.
People need to take responsibility for their own financial affairs. I mean, the government can't.
I tend to agree. Although I do think that, the cynic in me thinks that the reason why it's so loud right now isn't for those sort of pure purposes that you mentioned there, but rather, the Mortgage Broking Association and other finance brokers, their lobby groups are coming out in full force, and they're for lowering it to maybe benefit their own back pocket as well, because it'll make lending easier, which ostensibly gives them a higher and better trailing commission. So that's where my mindset is too. Just quickly, before we let you go, Peter, just broadly on the sort of finance and economics side, does the last 3 years of Labor get a pass or fail mark? And sort of what are the challenges for whatever government it is that comes to power at the end of this week? What are the challenges going to be for the next 3 years?
So I think the rhetoric of this government has been very good. Their explanation of the problem has been spot on, so that there have been quite a few reports and speeches and other communication from the government correctly identifying housing supply and in particular planning restrictions as the big problem that's making housing expensive. And I think that's a huge improvement on previous years where there was a lot of talk about negative gearing and housing bubbles and foreign investors and a lot of things that really do not matter that much. So the rhetoric has been good, and the target of 1.2 million homes that the National Cabinet has set, I think is a very good target and the sort of policy that we need. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the federal government do much towards achieving that target. We have seen a lot of very good policy from the New South Wales and Victorian governments. So the target is helping and things are moving in the right direction. It really could benefit with a bit more help from Canberra, though.
Well, whichever party gets up, let's just hope the next 3 years we see some improvements for a whole range of matters for the country, whether that is housing supply, cost of living, and so on and so forth. Peter Tulip, as always, thank you very much for your time on the Savings.com podcast. Really appreciate your insights.
Good to talk to you, Dominic. Bye, Harrison.
Thanks, Peter.